Hello, Pittsburgh. I'm Zach Gibson, and this is TribLive's From the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. With Pittsburgh's mayoral primary just around the corner on May 20th, the race is heating up and voters are paying close attention. Today, we're joined by Julia Burdelski, a seasoned TribLive reporter with deep experience covering the Steel City political beat. She's here to help us unpack the key players, pressing issues, and what's truly at stake in this high-profile local election. In the Democratic primary, incumbent Mayor Ed Gainey is seeking another term, but faces a challenge from Corey O'Connor, the Allegheny County Controller, and a well-known figure in city politics. On the Republican side, Tony Moreno, a retired police officer who has ran as a Democrat in 2021, is running again, this time alongside newcomer Thomas West, a businessman with a background in community development. Whether you're still deciding who to vote for or just want to get a clearer sense of the political landscape, this episode has you covered. Julia, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So, this is going to be a pretty introductory level conversation about this primary election and the candidates therein. I'm going to ask you to start with a quick overview. So can you introduce these candidates for the Pittsburgh mayoral primary, both on the Democratic and GOP sides? What should the listeners know about their backgrounds?
Absolutely. So first off, we'll start with the Democratic side. Mayor Ed Gainey is the incumbent, finishing up his first term. Prior to being mayor, he was a state representative. He is facing a challenger in Corey O'Connor, who is the Allegheny County Controller. He was previously a city councilman, and I think a lot of folks also recognize the name because he is the son of the late Mayor Bob O'Connor. Then on the Republican side, we have Tony Moreno, who is a retired police officer. He ran as a Democrat in the last mayoral election, lost in the primary, and then ran as a Republican and lost to Mayor Gainey there. And then we have a newcomer on the Republican side, and that is Thomas West. He is a small business owner and previously worked at WTAE and WPXI, two of our local news stations.
Okay. So are there any notable pieces or facets to these candidates that are really shaking things up in this race? Or is this shaping up to be a rematch between familiar faces, especially with Ed Gainey and Tony Moreno? These are faces we've seen before in 2021.
Absolutely. So, obviously, we know three of the four candidates from, prior political runs or political experience. But I think that there are a couple things about this race that are kind of unique. On the Democratic side in particular, we've heard a lot of kind of framing this local race through the lens of what is happening nationally. We've heard Mayor Gainey talking a lot about pushing back on Trump, and he has often tried to portray O'Connor as being, as he says, a MAGA Republican, kind of taking Republican donations. But then, of course, O'Connor pushes back and says, well, Gainey's taken money from the same donors. So it's been kind of interesting to see how those national trends kind of influence the local elections. I think also a lot of this is just reflective of the times that we're in generally. We're hearing a lot of talk about revitalizing downtown and whether downtown is safe. And of course, a lot of that is stemming from the issues that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic and the plummeting values of office space downtown, those sorts of things. So I think that a lot of the broader issues that we've been experiencing are kind of seeping into these local elections, which changes some of the dynamics and I think is driving what the main talking points are for the candidates in a lot of ways.
Okay. Well, since you brought them up, that was leading into my next question. What are some of these top issues for voters who are focused on this election coming on Monday? I know that some notable things throughout our coverage, affordable housing, policing and public transit, and economic development obviously has been as of late, becoming more increasingly important in the conversation of the future of Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I'll start with affordable housing because that's always a big topic. And it's interesting because there has been this spat over affordable housing data that has really become a focal point of the election. Even though it seems a little bit inside baseball to fight over the numbers, it's really become a key point here. Gainey is really trying to highlight a track record of building and developing affordable housing, really trying to paint that as an area where he's had success. And he has encouraged, or he has helped the URA to take out bond to fund more affordable housing. He has done, some things along those lines. But what's really interesting is we keep getting kind of caught up on these numbers where he keeps saying he's delivered 1,600 units of affordable housing. And O'Connor keeps pushing back on that because only about 500 of those projects have actually been finished. And of those 500 units, not all of them are new. Some of them are just preserving existing units.
Mm-hmm.
So that has become a big focal point. There's this, fight happening at city council that's been very influenced by the election over what we should do with a zoning code. Gainey has proposed inclusionary zoning citywide, which would mandate that all large developments set aside a portion of their housing units as affordable housing. O'Connor prefers a more measured approach, kind of going neighborhood by neighborhood, looking at what each neighborhood market seems like it would best support. And the Republicans also are not, in support of mandatory inclusionary zoning citywide. So that's been a big topic for sure, talking about what the future of affordable housing looks like. You also brought up, public safety and policing. That's been another big topic. Mayor Gainey loves to point out that homicides are down during his first term. And that kind of follows a national trend where we've seen homicides drop since the pandemic. But there have been issues in the police department also during Gainey's first term. We are on our 5th person at the top of the police department in just over 3 years. And so there have been a lot of concerns about instability there, which O'Connor is trying to kind of capitalize on. All of the candidates are talking about wanting to recruit and retain police officers better. They're talking about what we could do to, best utilize the limited resources we have in public safety to try to stretch dollars further in terms of upgrading a very aging public safety fleet. Things along those lines have definitely come up a lot. And I believe the other one you mentioned was economic development.
Yes.
And of course, a lot of that conversation has focused around downtown because we know that property values downtown have really declined since the pandemic. We have a lot of empty office spaces. The mayor has been pushing for converting a lot of that into housing, and particularly a lot of affordable housing. There is a $600 million plan championed by Governor Josh Shapiro trying to revitalize downtown. But some of the other candidates are looking to try to create a more diverse downtown base that's not as much focused on just housing. Although I think everyone is in agreement that housing plays some portion. O'Connor, as well as the Republicans, are arguing that there should also be more focus on business and perhaps some different innovative markets that could come in there, small business incubators, like those sorts of ideas have been tossed around. So there are certainly a lot of different topics that are being discussed at length during this primary.
Okay. Now, if you've gotten a chance to speak with many or a few voters through this process, what seems to be some of the most pressing issues for the people in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, we have talked to a good number of voters. I think what's really interesting is that voters seem to be very divided. We did a story specifically looking at Black Pittsburgh voters because this is our first Black mayor who is finishing his first term. And, that population was also very divided. I think, in talking with folks, some of the major issues that we have heard are affordable housing and what a candidate could do to make housing more affordable and to increase that supply. We also hear a lot about downtown, both in terms of revitalizing downtown and taking care of empty buildings, putting, breathing fresh life into those, but also in terms of safety. Regardless of what the crime statistics say, there are still folks who are concerned about downtown and whether it's always safe to be downtown. So we hear a lot of that. I think another topic that doesn't sound super interesting but matters a lot to people is just blight in neighborhoods. And are we cleaning up vacant properties? Are we tearing down buildings that are eyesores and potentially dangerous? Just kind of the everyday things that you notice while you're walking through your neighborhood. I think those things really matter to voters.
Okay. So now that we've laid out some of these important issues, I'm going to ask, how are these candidates starting to position themselves on these issues? Are there any sharp policy divides, both between the Democrats or the Republicans, but are there some unexpected areas of agreement, or what does it kind of look like in this grandstand?
Let me start broadly, and then we can go into a couple examples if that works. I think broadly speaking, Mayor Gainey is trying to portray his first term as one of success. He is really trying to say, I've done a lot of good in the first 3 years, and you should let me continue to build on that. And he points to, as I mentioned before, the homicides going down. He points to the affordable housing that has been created or is in the pipeline. He points to that $600 million downtown revitalization plan and winning the NFL draft coming here next year, those sorts of things. O'Connor really paints the opposite picture of the direction that the city is going in. And O'Connor is kind of portraying himself as a new leader who needs to step in and take control of situations that he feels are going downhill. He talks a lot about Pittsburgh deserving better. It's kind of his tagline, if you will. And so O'Connor is highlighting concerns around city finances, around public safety, around that instability at the top of the police department, the aging vehicle fleet. We had, for example, about a third of our snowplows out of order during a recent snowstorm. So he's highlighting kind of those problems and saying somebody needs to come in and address these issues before they get out of control. And then on the Republican side, both candidates are really positioning themselves as kind of the change maker candidates, because the city has not had a Republican mayor in about 100 years. So they're saying, look, you can't blame the Republicans for anything that's going bad in the city because we haven't been in charge. So anything that's, been a problem, Gainey and O'Connor have held office, and, the Republicans are saying that they haven't fixed things. And so they're saying we could step in, we could change things, we could bring completely fresh ideas. And that's kind of their position. In terms of specific areas where we've seen really sharp divides, I would say, a big one there, as we mentioned before, was affordable housing, in terms of whether we believe that there should be a mandate on developers to build affordable housing in all of their developments. And there are nuances to that in terms of, whether we should be funding that with public dollars or not. All kinds of different debates to be had around housing. The future of, public safety in terms of, what we should be doing with the police bureau. The Republicans are saying that we need even larger numbers of police than the Democrats are saying, but everybody is really in agreement that that's an area that needs work in terms of improving retention and recruitment in the bureau. City finances has become a very divisive topic. Again, Gainey is trying to say that everything is okay, and O'Connor and the Republicans are trying to say that we are walking off a cliff financially. So there are a lot of places where there's a lot of division, both in terms of what people would like to do moving forward and in their interpretation of how things are going now.
Okay. Now that brought up another question that I didn't initially intend to ask, but it came to my mind. Throughout this campaign season, have there been any events or situations that happened to any of these candidates that really propelled or damaged their potential credit or vision throughout leading up to this primary election?
That's a really good question. I think that because Gainey is the incumbent, he's the one in office, for better or for worse, he's the one who kind of is in the position where his record is most scrutinized, where he has the most opportunity to either do something good to propel himself forward or do something not good to hurt his chances.
Okay.
And so I think that there was a period, particularly a few months ago, where a lot of folks were kind of raising concerns about stability on Grant Street. And I think that probably did hurt Gainey's campaign a little bit. He had two police chiefs resign within just a couple months of each other. There had been a lot of concern about stability in the bureau. His chief of staff resigned with very little explanation, and that raised a lot of questions with folks. And I think that really gave an opening for the other candidates to criticize. I think also, though, on the flip side of that, like I said before, because Gainey is in office, he has been really making an effort recently to highlight the positive things as well. And so we have seen really just a flurry of activity from him around particularly housing, where he has really been trying to highlight the successes there and garner media attention and talk about that more often than he perhaps had before. For example, he had a series of press conferences where he was highlighting the fact that the city's land bank that had long not been operational was finally moving blighted properties and putting them into the hands of developers who could bring them to new use. Signed some executive orders trying to protect housing rights as a measure, kind of pushing back on some Trump administration policies, things like that. As far as, the other candidates, I think, O'Connor has kind of come under attack a lot for accepting the MAGA money, as the Gainey campaign says. It's hard for me to know how much damage I think that has done to his campaign, because he kind of clapped back and said that Gainey had done the same. I think another thing that hurt the O'Connor camp a little bit was there was a mailer that his independent expenditure sent out, which a lot of elected officials and community organizers thought was inappropriate or unfair, misleading, and some of them said racist. It tried to kind of link Gainey to a legacy of blight that existed long before he was elected, and a lot of folks kind of took offense to linking the city's first Black mayor with a long-standing issue of blight that was not created under his administration.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, like, the photo on the front of the flyer was a building that has actually since been renovated and is no longer an example of blight. So I think that caused a bit of an uproar. But to be fair, we also need to acknowledge that did not come directly from the O'Connor campaign. That came from an independent expenditure. So it wasn't something he did directly. On the Republican side, I think the Republicans tend to get a little bit less attention because the city tends to elect Democrats overwhelmingly. So they haven't really caused quite as much of a splash yet, at least. But like I said, I think that they're really focused on trying to capitalize on any problems that the Democrats have and kind of use that to buoy their own campaigns.
Okay. So, moving on in this conversation, Pittsburgh politics can be incredibly neighborhood driven. So, how, if at all, have you seen candidates tailor their messages to resonate with places like East End or South Hills or the North Side?
I am actually very curious to see, once we get the election results in, what neighborhoods kind of go most heavily for each candidate. Obviously, the mayor is from the East End, so you kind of anticipate that he might have a little bit more of a base there. He represented that area when he was in Harrisburg. And I think just generally, when you're from an area, maybe you get a little bit more support there. You kind of know people more. You're more active in those communities. But we've seen O'Connor kind of take a strategy, I think, of trying to reach out to the communities that don't get as much attention, particularly kind of the South Hills, West End neighborhoods. He's tried to kind of court those, I think, a little bit more intentionally, and he has the endorsements of those council members who represent those areas, which, I think that helps as well. So it'll be really interesting, I think, to see specifically which neighborhoods are the most divided or the most unified behind one candidate or another. That'll be really interesting to see once we get the election results.
Okay. Now, generally, I'm sure this is the case with many other cities, as all the previous cities I've lived in, it was the case. Turnouts in primaries tend to be on the lower side. But what does the mood feel like this year? Are voters really feeling energized, or is there some kind of analysis that gives us a preview or an idea of what this turnout could look like?
As you said, it's probably safe to assume that voter turnout won't be incredibly high since it is a primary and it is an odd year election. That said, I think that the mayor's seat in Pittsburgh is an important seat. I think it's a high profile seat. And I think that there are people who are very, very passionate about specific candidates in this race. So while I would not expect this to hit, presidential election kind of voter turnout, I do think that there's energy behind this race. I do think that there are people who feel very, very passionately about one candidate or another. And I imagine that will certainly drive some folks to the polls.
Okay. So my final question as we start to wrap up, looking ahead past this primary, once we have whatever the results may be, we will have a new race to start to analyze. So how could the results of this primary shape the general election? And more broadly, what could this mean for the future of the political direction of Pittsburgh?
In Pittsburgh, we have not elected a Republican mayor in about 100 years. So there is generally an assumption that whoever wins the Democratic primary will win the November general election. So I think that to a large extent, a lot of people will kind of feel like the race is over after May. But of course, the Republicans also will have a candidate on the ballot in November. So there will, as you said, still be a contested race looking ahead to November. And there will actually be a couple of contested city council races in November as well. So there's still a lot to be determined between May and November. But I think generally speaking, most of the attention is going to be on the Democrats just because of that, century-long streak that they have had in power in the city. I think that we'll see. I think that this election will largely be a referendum on how Gainey has done in his first term and how people view the incumbent mayor. In talking to experts, they often kind of point out that when you have a primary challenger, that normally means that there's some discontent and division within the party. And I think that we see that division playing out locally, where some folks love Gainey and some hate him, and some love O'Connor and some hate him. But I think this is also, to an extent, reflective of kind of that broader national trend. Since the Democrats suffered those defeats in November, there has nationally been a reckoning around whether the party should go more moderate or more progressive, what has the best chance of winning in a November general election, what is just the future of the party broadly. So I think that's also part of what we're seeing, with Gainey kind of portraying himself as the more progressive, O'Connor being still pretty progressive, but a little bit more moderate perhaps. And like I mentioned before, I think also, we're hearing a lot of that discourse about the national trends in this race. So I think that to some extent, that will maybe be a bit of a pattern to watch moving forward in terms of, is Pittsburgh perhaps leaning a little bit more progressive, perhaps a little bit more moderate, or is this really just a referendum on how one particular mayor has done in his first term?
Okay. Well, Julia, thank you for coming on to help lay out this primary race, and I look forward to breaking into some of the details ahead of the general election.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zach Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.